They say that on misty nights, when the moon is just a sliver over the Appalachian peaks, the ghost of a red-haired man can be seen wandering the old Cherokee lands. He walks through the ghosts of towns he himself burned to the ground, Chota, Tellico, Chilhowie, forever hearing the cries of those his campaigns left to starve in the winter cold. This restless spirit, they say, is Arthur Campbell, a man his own people called the Red Fox, a celebrated founder of southwestern Virginia and a protector of the frontier. Was he the necessary guardian of a fledgling civilization, forced into brutal acts to save his kin? Or was he a monster of ambition, who used total war to carve out an empire from the ashes of another people? Today, we're going to untangle the legend from the man. We will follow the trail of the Red Fox, from his capture as a boy to his reign as a political king, to understand how one person could become both a revered pioneer and the eternal, haunting specter of the lands he conquered. To understand the Red Fox, you have to understand the world that made him. The late 1700s in Augusta County, Virginia, was not a place of gentle living. It was the absolute edge of the known world, a raw frontier where life was measured in seasons and survival was a daily struggle. Arthur Campbell was born into this world in 1743, the son of Scots-Irish immigrants. These weren't people who bowed to kings or coastal aristocrats. They were clannish, stubborn, and fiercely independent, and they had pushed into the mountains seeking land that they could hold by the strength of their own hands. This environment was a forge, and it hammered boys into hard men. But for Arthur, the true crucible came when he was just 15 years old. During the French and Indian War, while out on a mission, the boy was captured by a party of Wyandot warriors. For most, this was a death sentence, or a life of brutal servitude. For Arthur Campbell, it became a dark and transformative education. He was taken hundreds of miles away, deep into the Ohio country near the Great Lakes, and for nearly 3 years, he lived as they lived. He wasn't just a captive, he was a student of survival. He learned their languages, he learned to track game and to move through the forest without a sound. But most importantly, he learned their way of war. He saw firsthand the art of the ambush, the psychological terror of the raid, and the supreme value of cunning over brute force. He watched how they used the very landscape as a weapon, melting into the woods like ghosts. These were lessons that could not be taught in any European army. Then, after almost 3 years, he made his escape. It was a harrowing journey, hundreds of miles through a hostile wilderness with nothing but the skills he had learned from his captors. He survived on nuts, roots, and an iron will. The boy who was captured in that mountain pass was gone forever. The one who stumbled back into the Virginia settlements was a young man, but with the cold, ancient eyes of a survivor. He was harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. The wilderness had tried to swallow him whole, and in the process, he had swallowed a piece of it right back. The man who returned from the Ohio wilderness was not the same one who had left. With his shock of red hair and a new, unsettling stillness in his eyes, he quickly earned the nickname that would follow him to the grave, the Red Fox. He settled in the Holston River Valley, a beautiful but dangerous stretch of land that would become the heart of his domain. Here, in a time of relative quiet, the Red Fox built a life. He married Margaret Campbell, a cousin, and together they began to raise a family that would eventually number 13 children. In these years, before the great wars that would define his legacy, Campbell was seen as the quintessential pillar of the frontier community. He was a successful farmer, a surveyor, and a man whose counsel was sought on everything from planting corn to fortifying a cabin against attack. He became a justice of the peace and a captain in the local militia. When there was a dispute between neighbors, they brought it to Arthur Campbell. When a hunting party went missing, it was Arthur Campbell who organized the search. He was the anchor in a sea of uncertainty. His authority came from his experience. The other settlers were brave and tough, but Campbell possessed a deeper, colder knowledge. He understood the forest and the men who moved through it in a way no one else did. He taught his neighbors how to read the signs of an approaching war party, how to fight from behind trees instead of in open lines, and how to think like the enemy. He was their shield, the man who had been inside the belly of the beast and returned to tell them how to slay it. This was the world the Red Fox built and fought to protect, a fragile collection of cabins and clearings, filled with his kin and his neighbors, all clinging to a precarious existence at the edge of a continent. It was a life built on family loyalty, community dependence, and the constant simmering threat of violence. The love he had for his wife and children, and the fierce paternalistic duty he felt for the people who looked to him for safety, became the driving forces behind every decision he would ever make. Everything that came later, all the fire and the blood, was done to protect this small world he had carved out of the wilderness. But a man forged in such a fire is often left with brittle places. Arthur Campbell's greatest strength, that unyielding will to protect his family and his domain, was inextricably bound to his fatal flaw, an absolute, unshakable belief that his authority was the only authority that mattered. He had survived where others had perished. He had brought order to a land of chaos, and in his mind, this gave him a right to rule. He saw himself not as a leader, but as the patriarch of the entire region, and any challenge to his will was not a simple disagreement. It was a threat to the natural order of things. There's a story that perfectly illustrates this. A few years after the revolution, a new family of settlers arrived with a land grant signed and sealed by the authorities back in Richmond. The tract of land they claimed overlapped with pasture that one of Campbell's sons had been using. By the letter of the law, the new family had the stronger claim. But that was a law made by men in powdered wigs hundreds of miles away. Campbell summoned the family's patriarch to his home. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply sat the man down and explained, in his quiet, cold way, that the laws of Richmond were a distant whisper in these mountains. The only law that kept families safe from famine or the tomahawk was the law of mutual respect and established order. And in the Holston Valley, he was that order. The new settler, a proud man himself, insisted on his legal rights. Campbell just nodded. Within a week, the man found no one would trade with him at the local mill. His neighbors, loyal to Campbell, suddenly became distant and cold. When one of his cattle went missing, the search party Campbell organized found no trace of it. There was no violence, no open threat, just a slow, suffocating isolation. The family was gone within the month, their legal grant worthless against the silent, absolute power of the Red Fox. For Campbell, this wasn't about a piece of pasture land. It was about precedent. He believed that compromise was weakness, and weakness invited chaos. He could not bend, he could not yield, because to do so would be to admit that some other power, be it the government in Richmond or a rival on the frontier, had a say in the survival of his people. His authority had to be as solid and immovable as the mountains themselves. This towering pride, this inability to brook any rival or share any power, was the crack in his armor. It had served him well when crushing the will of his enemies or intimidating a lone settler. But it was a flaw that was bound to lead him into a conflict he couldn't control with a quiet word or a silent shunning. It would eventually put him face to face with men as proud and as stubborn as himself, and in the unforgiving calculus of the frontier, such a collision could only be settled with fire and blood. The ink on the treaty that ended the revolution was barely dry, but peace never lasts long in the mountains. The new conflict, however, wouldn't be fought with tomahawks and rifles, but with petitions, politics, and the threat of civil war. Just south of Campbell's domain, in the settlements along the Watauga and Nolichucky rivers, a storm was brewing. These lands, technically part of North Carolina, were populated by the same hardened over-mountain men Campbell had fought beside. When North Carolina, in a political move, ceded these western lands to the federal government, the settlers felt abandoned, left without laws or protection. So they did something unthinkable. They did what mountain people have always done when ignored by a distant government. They formed their own. In 1784, they declared themselves an independent state, writing a constitution and electing a governor. They called their new nation the State of Franklin. From his home in the Holston Valley, Arthur Campbell watched this unfold, not as a distant observer, but as a predator watches a rival enter its territory. This wasn't some far-off tax dispute. This was a new center of power, a new government, rising on his very doorstep. For a man whose entire identity was built on being the supreme, unchallenged authority of his region, this was the ultimate affront. The existence of Franklin, led by the popular war hero John Sevier, was a direct challenge to his throne. It siphoned away influence, it offered an alternative to his leadership, and it threatened to make him a secondary figure in the story of the West. It violated the core principle of his being, that in these mountains, his will was law. This new state was a living, breathing rejection of that idea. Campbell's reaction was immediate and visceral, but it wasn't born of simple anger. It was born of pure, cold ambition. A lesser man might have sided with Virginia and tried to crush the upstart state. But the Red Fox saw a different path. His fatal flaw, his absolute belief in his own authority, saw this not as a threat to be destroyed, but as an opportunity to be seized. If there was going to be a new kingdom on the frontier, he would not be its neighbor. He would be its king. He made a fateful choice. He began to scheme, using his vast influence to convince the citizens of his own Washington County, Virginia, to secede from their state and join the state of Franklin. It was a breathtaking act of treason. He was willing to betray the Commonwealth he served, to risk being hanged as a traitor, all for the chance to absorb this new rival power and weld it into a larger domain under his control. This was the point of no return. He had looked upon the challenge to his authority and, driven by his unyielding pride, decided not just to meet it, but to escalate it into an all-or-nothing gamble for absolute power. News of Arthur Campbell's treasonous scheme traveled fast, like a fire in the dry grass of autumn. It didn't take long for it to reach the capital in Richmond and the ears of a man who knew a thing or two about rebellion, Governor Patrick Henry. The governor's response was swift, a letter that was both a velvet glove and an iron fist. He praised Campbell for his past service to Virginia, acknowledging him as a hero of the Revolution. But he also demanded, in no uncertain terms, an explanation for the rumors of secession. It was a calculated move, a political off-ramp offered by one of the most powerful men in the country. It was a chance for the Red Fox to bow, to claim it was all a misunderstanding, and to pull back from the brink without losing face. But Arthur Campbell did not see a lifeline. He saw an insult. Who was Patrick Henry, a man of speeches and cities, to tell him how to govern his mountains? Campbell replied with a letter of his own, a masterpiece of political deflection. He assured the governor of his loyalty to Virginia, while simultaneously arguing for the natural right of frontier people to determine their own governance. He was playing a dangerous double game, trying to placate Richmond with words while continuing his secessionist machinations in secret. He was convinced that the state government was too weak and too distant to stop him. His pride blinded him to the reality that he was no longer fighting a disorganized tribe or a local rival. He was challenging the authority of a sovereign state. The warnings didn't just come from Richmond. They came from his own people, from the men who had stood with him at Point Pleasant and shivered through the winter campaigns against the Cherokee. Old allies, men whose loyalty he had never had to question, came to him privately. They spoke not of treason, but of practicality. They warned him that he was splitting the county, pitting families against each other who had once stood united against a common foe. They begged him to reconsider, to find a compromise, to not tear apart the very community he had built with his own hands. Campbell heard their words not as the counsel of friends, but as the whispers of cowards. He saw their caution as a betrayal of the bold, frontier spirit that had won them this land in the first place. He dismissed their concerns, sometimes with a cold stare, sometimes with a sharp reminder of who had led them through the darkest days. Each time an old friend urged him to step back, Campbell pushed them away, convinced they had lost their nerve. His circle of trusted allies began to shrink, replaced by sycophants and hotheads who shared his ambition. He was becoming a general with no army, a king with a shrinking kingdom. Meanwhile, his chief rival, William Russell, seized the opportunity. Russell saw Campbell's treason not just as a danger to Virginia, but as the perfect weapon to finally destroy the Red Fox. He became the leader of the Loyalist faction in Washington County, organizing opposition, holding his own militia musters, and sending a steady stream of reports to Governor Henry, detailing Campbell's every move. The political feud had now escalated into a Cold War fought in the cabins and courtrooms of the Holston Valley. Every choice Campbell made to further his secessionist plot only strengthened Russell's hand and drove a deeper wedge into the heart of the community. The Red Fox was walking a path of his own making, and it was narrowing with every stubborn step. A violent collision was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The Holston Valley had become a powder keg, and everyone could smell the fuse. Militias were drilling on both sides, the Loyalists under William Russell on one green, and Campbell's secessionists on another. Old friends now crossed the road to avoid each other's gaze. Families were split down the middle. The air was thick with the tension of impending civil war. It was in this moment, with the region teetering on the brink of bloodshed, that Arthur Campbell was given one last clear chance to choose a different path. And it came not from a governor or a rival, but from the one person who knew the man behind the legend. One evening, as he sat alone by the fire, poring over maps and lists of men loyal to his cause, his wife Margaret came to him. She was a strong frontier woman, no stranger to hardship or danger, but he could see a profound weariness in her eyes. She carried no political arguments or legal warnings. She carried the weight of their world. She sat beside him and spoke quietly of the fear she saw growing in the community. She told him of the women who stopped her by the creek, asking if it was true that their husbands and sons would soon have to fight their own neighbors. She didn't speak of Virginia or the state of Franklin. She spoke of their own home, of their own children. She asked him to look at the life they had built, the peace they had earned through so much struggle and loss. Was this ambition, this new title in this new state, worth the blood of the very people they had sworn to protect? Was it worth their own sons having to aim a rifle at a cousin or a childhood friend? It was the most direct plea imaginable, a choice between the abstract lure of power and the tangible reality of the family and community he claimed to be serving. For a long moment, the Red Fox was silent. The firelight played across his face, and in the shifting shadows, one could almost see the war raging within him. He looked at his wife, the mother of his children, the woman who had stood by him through everything. He saw the truth in her words. He saw the precipice, the dark chasm of violence that lay just one step ahead. He could pull back. He could send a rider to Russell, call a truce, and begin the hard work of mending what he had broken. He could choose his family over his pride. But then his eyes hardened. To back down now, after going so far, felt like the ultimate defeat. He pictured William Russell's smug satisfaction. He pictured his authority, the very foundation of his identity, crumbling to dust. In his mind, retreat was not a path to peace. It was an invitation for his enemies to destroy him utterly. He turned to Margaret, and the warmth had gone from his voice. "Peace is bought with strength, Margaret," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "To show weakness now is to lose everything we have ever fought for." With that, he turned back to his maps. The final crossroads had been reached, and Arthur Campbell had consciously, deliberately, chosen the road to war. The day of the reckoning arrived with the cold bite of a late autumn wind. It was court day in Washington County, the one time when all factions were forced to converge on a single point. But this was no day for civil discourse. Two armed camps had formed on the green outside the small log courthouse. On one side stood William Russell and the Virginia Loyalists, a grim line of farmers and militiamen. On the other, His face as hard and unforgiving as the mountains behind him was Arthur Campbell and his secessionists. The two groups stared at each other across 100 yards of frozen mud, a space that felt as wide and as deep as a grave. The tension was a living thing, a coiled snake in the center of the green. Men clutched their long rifles, their knuckles white. Words were exchanged, first as low mutters, then as angry shouts that were snatched away by the wind. The final spark came when William Russell, determined to assert the authority of Virginia, took a deliberate step toward the courthouse door, his hand raised. He declared Campbell's assembly illegal and ordered the men to disperse in the name of the Commonwealth. For the Red Fox, this was the ultimate challenge, a public stripping of his power, an act he could not possibly tolerate. In that instant, the world seemed to narrow for Arthur Campbell. The shouting, the wind, the faces of his own men, it all faded into a dull roar. The only thing he could see with perfect clarity was William Russell, his rival, the one man who stood between him and absolute control. The sun glinted off the barrel of a rifle somewhere to his left. He felt the familiar cold weight of the horse pistol tucked in his belt, his hand moving toward it with a will of its own, a lifetime of frontier instinct taking over. He had made his decision weeks ago, in the quiet of his own home. This was just the echo. A single sharp report cracked the cold air and the world erupted. It wasn't a battle, it was a chaotic close-quarters brawl of smoke and thunder. Flashes of orange powder burst from the two lines as a ragged volley was exchanged. Men didn't charge so much as stumble forward, the roar of muskets and pistols deafening. Through the swirling, acrid smoke, Campbell saw only one thing. Russell, his face a mask of fury, trying to bring order to his panicked men. The two leaders locked eyes across the maelstrom. For a frozen moment, the entire conflict, the struggle for the soul of the frontier, was reduced to these two men. Their hands moved in a blur of practiced motion. A final deafening shot echoed off the log walls of the courthouse, louder and more final than all the others. The argument that had torn a county in two, that had pitted neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother, was suddenly, permanently over. A chilling, unnatural silence fell over the courthouse green, broken only by the moaning of the wind and the groans of a few wounded men. The powder smoke, thick and grey like a mountain fog, began to slowly clear, revealing the terrible tableau. Men from both sides stood frozen, their weapons half lowered, staring in shock not at an enemy, but at the undeniable consequences of their own rage. Arthur Campbell stood alone in the center of it all. He slowly lowered his pistol, the barrel still smoking in the frigid air. He had won. The challenge to his authority had been met and utterly vanquished. But as he looked out at the wreckage of his community, at the faces of men he had known his entire life, now twisted in horror and grief, there was no triumph in his gaze. There was only the cold, empty silence of a king who had just burned his own kingdom to secure his throne. The sharp crack of the final shot was followed by a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. For a long moment, no one moved. The men on the courthouse green, friends and enemies alike, stood like statues of clay, their faces blank with shock. The Red Fox stood at the center of this frozen tableau, the smoking pistol still heavy in his hand. There was no look of triumph on his face, no flicker of rage or regret. There was only a cold, profound emptiness. The metallic taste of gun smoke filled his mouth. The problem of William Russell had been solved. His instincts, honed over decades of survival, took over. He did not run. He did not surrender. To do either would be to admit he had done something wrong, and in his mind, he had simply restored order. With a slow, deliberate motion that drew every eye, he began to reload his pistol. It was a terrifyingly calm gesture, an unmistakable message to every man on that green. The violence was done, but his capacity for it was not. He was still the most dangerous man in the valley. With his weapon reloaded and tucked back into his belt, he turned his back on the body of his fallen rival. He did not give it a second glance. He looked to his own men, who were staring at him with a mixture of awe and fear. His voice cut through the silence, not a shout, but a low command that carried with its own absolute authority. "See to our wounded," he ordered. "Then disarm the rest of them. Their foolishness is at an end." He was no longer a politician or a rebel. He was a general on a battlefield of his own making, and he was taking control of the field. Without another word, he walked through the stunned crowd. Men, both his own and Russell's, parted before him, their eyes avoiding his. He moved not like a man fleeing a crime, but like a landowner inspecting his property. He reached his horse, swung himself into the saddle, and rode away from the courthouse, leaving behind a community shattered by his actions. His active role in the physical conflict was over. He had gambled everything on a single violent act, and he had won. But as he rode into the cold hills, the end of this road was simply the beginning of another, far more treacherous one. The law of the mountains had been satisfied. Now he would have to face the law of man. The echo of that final gunshot on the courthouse green did not fade. It settled into the soil of Washington County like a poison, contaminating everything it touched. The single act of violence didn't end the conflict. It transformed a political dispute into a blood feud, a wound that would never properly heal. The men who had faced off against each other went home that day, but they did not go home to peace. They carried the ghost of the confrontation with them, and it sat at their dinner tables and whispered to them in their sleep. For the family of William Russell, the world had been turned upside down. They were now a family without a patriarch, their name forever linked to a public violent death at the hands of their greatest rival. Their grief quickly hardened into a cold, simmering hatred that would be passed down like an inheritance. Every Campbell they saw, every mention of the Red Fox name, was a fresh twist of the knife. Their honor demanded a balancing of the scales, a debt that they would wait years, even generations, to collect if they had to. But the wreckage was not confined to one side. Arthur Campbell had won the field, but in doing so, he had isolated his own family. They were now the clan of the killer. Respect was replaced by fear, and friendship was replaced by a cautious, resentful distance. His wife, Margaret, now had to live the very nightmare she had foreseen, facing the accusing eyes of her neighbors, her children growing up under the shadow of their father's violent legacy. They were safe, yes, but they were surrounded by a wall of silent condemnation built by their father's own hands. The grand political dream of secession was dead, drowned in the blood on the courthouse lawn. The state of Franklin, seeing the fratricidal violence Campbell's ambition had unleashed, wanted no part of Washington County. Campbell had broken his own community for a prize that no longer existed. The energy of the frontier, once directed outward against the wilderness and external threats, was now turned inward. The project of building a civilization ground to a halt, consumed by suspicion and bitterness. The tragedy of that day wasn't just the death of one man, it was the death of trust. The Red Fox, in his obsessive quest to protect his community's order, had shattered its soul. The news of William Russell's death and the armed insurrection at the courthouse galloped all the way to Richmond, and this time, Governor Patrick Henry could not respond with a mere letter. The Commonwealth of Virginia had been openly defied, its authority challenged by one of its own. A charge of murder was drawn up against Arthur Campbell, and the slow, heavy machinery of the law began to grind its way toward the mountains. But this would be no ordinary trial. It was a clash of two worlds, set to play out in the very log courthouse where the blood had been spilled. The trial was a spectacle of tension. On one side stood the prosecutor from Richmond, a man of books and statutes, who spoke of malice aforethought and seditious conspiracy. He laid out a clear, legalistic case. Arthur Campbell, in his lust for power, had raised a private army, defied the state, and murdered its loyal representative. To the world outside the mountains, the case was open and shut. But the prosecutor wasn't speaking to the world. He was speaking to a jury of 12 grim-faced frontiersmen, men who had known both Campbell and Russell their entire lives. When Arthur Campbell spoke in his own defense, he did not plead or make excuses. He stood before the jury not as a criminal, but as their patriarch, their war leader, explaining a difficult but necessary decision. He didn't speak the language of the law, he spoke the language of the mountains. He argued that William Russell's actions were a direct threat to the stability and survival of their entire community. He wasn't just a political opponent, he was an agent of chaos. In the unwritten, brutal constitution of the frontier, a direct challenge to the established leader in a time of crisis was a declaration of war. He framed his act not as murder, but as a battlefield necessity, the regrettable but unavoidable removal of a threat to prevent a wider, bloodier conflict. He looked into the eyes of the jurors, many of whom he had led through fire and snow, and silently asked them, "Which law do you truly live by? Theirs or ours?" The community, and the jury with it, was ripped in two. The Russell clan and their allies saw a cold-blooded murderer on trial and demanded the gallows. But many more saw something else. They saw the Red Fox, the man who had kept their families safe for decades, being judged by a distant, alien set of rules that didn't understand their world. The jurors were caught in an impossible position. To convict Campbell would be to defy the most powerful man they had ever known, a man whose clan could make their lives a living hell. To acquit him would be to sanction a killing and invite the eternal vengeance of the Russell family. In the end, after a tense deliberation, the verdict was read in the silent, crowded courtroom. Not guilty. A gasp went through the room, a mixture of outrage from one side and profound, grim relief from the other. Arthur Campbell simply nodded, his expression unchanging, and walked out a free man. But was justice served? Not by any modern standard. The verdict was not a statement of innocence, it was a verdict of fear and loyalty. It was a declaration that in the Holston River Valley, the law of Virginia was merely a suggestion. The true law was the will of the Red Fox. The court had washed its hands of the matter, but in doing so, it had left the blood debt unpaid, leaving it to fester in the shadows, waiting for a different kind of judgment. William Russell's story, of course, ended on that frozen patch of ground outside the courthouse. He paid the ultimate price in his feud with the Red Fox, his life cut short by a pistol ball. But it would be a mistake to remember him as a simple martyr, a righteous man cut down by an unhinged villain. The truth, as it always is in the mountains, is far more complicated. Russell was no saint. He was a formidable rival, cut from the same hard, ambitious cloth as Campbell himself. Their feud was a clash of two mountain lions fighting for the same territory. When Campbell began his treasonous plot, Russell didn't just see a threat to Virginia. He saw his ultimate opportunity to finally break the Red Fox's power. He was not just a patriot defending his state. He was a political predator moving in for the kill. And in a bitter twist of frontier justice, William Russell achieved in death what he could not guarantee in life. His violent, public end became a symbol of Campbell's tyrannical overreach. The sheer brutality of the act horrified the very people Campbell was trying to lead. Any romantic notions of creating a new frontier republic were washed away in the blood of a neighbor. The state of Franklin, witnessing the fratricidal chaos, recoiled from the idea of admitting Campbell's fractured county into their union. The secession movement died right there on the courthouse green alongside the man who had opposed it. So, who truly won that day? Arthur Campbell walked away a free man, but his grand political scheme was left in ashes, and his reputation was forever stained with a kinsman's blood. He had won the personal duel, but lost the political war. William Russell lay in a cold grave, but his cause, the cause of keeping Washington County tethered to Virginia, had triumphed. His death ensured the very outcome he had fought for. It was a messy, unsatisfying, and tragic end for both men, proving that on the frontier, sometimes even the victor loses everything that matters. Arthur Campbell lived for another 2 decades after the trial, a wealthy and powerful old man who died in his bed in 1811. He was, by all accounts, a success. He had built a dynasty, amassed a fortune in land, and outlived nearly all his enemies. But the victory he had secured on the courthouse green was a bitter one, and its poison seeped into the long years that followed. He was no longer the beloved patriarch of the Holston Valley. He was its feared and isolated king, ruling over a kingdom of silent resentment. The community did what mountain communities always do after a deep trauma. They buried it under a blanket of silence. The courthouse shooting was not spoken of in public. It became a dark secret that everyone knew, but no one acknowledged. A ghost at every wedding and funeral. People had to live together, to raise barns and fight fires side by side, so they forced a fragile peace. But the trust was gone. The old bonds of unquestioning loyalty had been severed, and in their place grew a quiet, watchful suspicion. The legacy of that day was carried most heavily by the next generation. The Campbell children inherited their father's land and influence, but also the stain of his name. They had to navigate a world where many of their neighbors saw them not as friends, but as the offspring of a tyrant. The Russell clan, meanwhile, became the keepers of the grudge. The story of William Russell's death became their family's founding myth, a tale of martyrdom that fueled a quiet, patient hatred that would simmer for generations, waiting for any opportunity to settle the score. As the years passed, the world changed around the aging Red Fox. The frontier pushed further west, and the Holston Valley became a more settled, civilized place. New leaders emerged, men who fought their battles in legislative chambers and courtrooms, not with pistols on the lawn. Campbell's brutal personal style of authority became a relic of a bygone era. The very civilization he had bled to establish was now making him obsolete. He had won the right to rule his mountain, but in the end, the mountain had simply grown past him, leaving him a lonely, feared figure, forever haunted by the silence of the community he had broken. If you travel today through the mountains of southwestern Virginia, you can still find the tracks of the Red Fox. The land he claimed is still there, crisscrossed by roads and dotted with towns he never could have imagined. Near the town of Marion, you can find the site of his home, Campbell's Choice. And in the old Royal Oak Cemetery, you can lay a hand on his weathered tombstone. These are the cold, hard facts of his life, carved in stone and written on deeds. But the true ghost of Arthur Campbell doesn't live in the graveyards or the history books. It lives in the whispers. Over the centuries, the man has been consumed by the myth. The stories told about him in the hollows are not about land deals or legislative votes. They are about the uncanny cunning that no ordinary man should possess. The old folks say that during his captivity, he didn't just learn to hunt like the Wyandot. He learned their magic. They say a shaman taught him how to walk between the worlds, to move like a shadow through the woods, and know an enemy's plan before it was even formed. How else, they ask, could he appear from nowhere to strike the Cherokee, or anticipate every move of his political rivals? The darkest legends, of course, are told by the descendants of those he destroyed. They still tell the story of a Cherokee medicine man who laid a curse upon the Red Fox. He decreed that Campbell's spirit would never know peace, but would be forced to wander the ruins of the towns he burned for all eternity, his fiery red hair blazing in the gloom, forever hearing the ghostly cries of the starving and the slain. It is this story that gives the hook its power, the idea that a man's violence could so profoundly scar a landscape that his spirit is forever trapped there. Arthur Campbell is more than a historical figure now. He is a cautionary tale, a boogeyman, a local legend. He is the human face of the brutal bargain that was struck to settle these mountains. His name is whispered to remind children of the darkness that lies in ambition, and to remind adults that the foundations of their peaceful homes are built upon acts of terrible, unforgiving violence. The man is long dead, but his spirit, the embodiment of that ruthless, brilliant and terrifying frontier will, still haunts these mountains. For better or for worse, the shadow of the Red Fox is a part of the land itself. So we return to the question we asked at the beginning. Sitting here in the long shadow of the mountains, was Arthur Campbell a hero or a villain? The truth is, he was something far more complicated and far more human. He was a founder. He was one of those hard, uncompromising men who carved a civilization out of a wilderness. Such work is never clean. To his people, he was a shield. To the Cherokee, he was a specter of destruction. To his rivals, he was a tyrant. The Red Fox was the human embodiment of the frontier itself, creative and destructive, magnificent and terrible, a force of nature that built a new world by clearing away the old with fire and with fear. In the end, this is a story about how a man's greatest strength, his unbending iron will to protect and control his domain, can become the very thing that poisons his soul. That same quality that made him the perfect leader to survive the French and Indian War made him incapable of accepting a political rival in a time of peace. He loved his community so fiercely that when it dared to defy him, he was willing to break it in two rather than bend his own pride. He was a man who looked at the untamed wilderness and saw a home for his children and was willing to commit any sin to secure it. He looked at a rival and saw not a neighbor with a different opinion, but a threat that had to be eliminated. His story is a timeless, tragic lesson written into the very bedrock of these mountains, a reminder that the line between a protector and a predator is often nothing more than a single, irrevocable choice made in a moment of anger. And that, my friends, is the ballad of the Red Fox, a man who built a kingdom for his family, but loved his own crown just a little bit more.